Thankful to be back. We are encouraged to have been able to go spend some time up at New Testament Baptist Church up in Ohio. They were putting on a lesson series for pastors and preachers, missionaries, teachers, kind of going through some lessons, interestingly enough, lessons through the book of Acts. Just enjoyed our time up there. So from Brother Jack Holbrook and the people at New Testament Baptist Church, I know several of them said hi to everybody. Also Beverly Manor Baptist Church over near, it's over in the Peoria area. It's over in Washington, Illinois. Brother Jason Schultz was kind of heading up this session of classes, and I know he asked about a few people here. Also got to visit with Brother Isaac Heil and Brother Jason Reinhardt, Brother Daniel Pearson. Those are three missionaries that we've known for quite a while, just enjoyed our time getting to kind of spend some time with them. Be sure and pray for those guys. I know Brother Daniel Pearson is trying to get some stuff, a mission work going, and he had kind of done a lot of deputation and really trying to focus. I would describe it as trying to reach some of the inner cities of the Cincinnati area. We got Brother Jason Reinhardt, who spent 20 plus years in Peru and is now back in the States, looking to have a Spanish-speaking ministry here somewhere in the States. And then, of course, Brother Isaac Heil. Brother Isaac has a different kind of ministry, but one that I think is still very important. He has an opportunity to meet with a bunch of people from different countries that are here in the U.S., and in the course of those meetings with them, uses the Bible to teach them a lot of things. And then, of course, many of them, they don't stay here. They go back to their countries of origin. And it's just a neat thing. I often envision when you see things like Brother Isaac Heil and you see things like what Brother Fayard does, where Brother Fayard goes and he's in the ports going up on the ships that are coming in and out of the country. It reminds me a lot of what the Apostle Paul did. Is the Apostle Paul traveled all over the world, yes, but when you've spent much time studying the places he went, he often went to cities that were hubs of commerce and trade, and they were cities that were crossroads for different places. And you know that whenever he would preach and people were saved, and oftentimes they would not stay necessarily in those cities but would go back to where they came from, you just see how the gospel is spread, and just a neat thing to think about. So be sure and be praying for those brothers and others too, that we met some new people and had some good time of fellowship with old friends, and we're just thankful that we were able to go. All right, but that is not what we're talking about today. We are back in the book of Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. We've been working our way through this chapter fairly slowly. There's a lot that's covered here, and really what we're doing is we're taking the opportunity. In our first lesson on this chapter, we kind of went through the whole chapter and we gave you the summary, if you remember. In chapter 6, Stephen is accused of some things. He's actually accused of trying to overthrow the law of Moses and to do away with the traditions of Moses, and that Jesus is going to come and destroy the temple. And what you see in chapter 7, of course, is his defense before the Sanhedrin Council. And a lot of people don't understand what chapter 7 is about. And it was interesting. We actually talked about chapter 7 in this Acts class earlier this week. And it was very similar to some of the things we've already talked about, right? I mean, some people look at chapter 7 and they just see it this rolling history of Stephen talking about, Moses and Abraham and the Egyptian Exodus and things like that. And they almost don't see the connection, like why is he even doing this? But listen, he is defending himself for the things that he has been accused of. And we talked about the fact that part of this, I think, is showing the Sanhedrin Council, listen, I know what I'm talking about, right? I know the story of Abraham. I know the story of Moses. I know the Exodus. I know the tabernacle and the temple and all of these things. He's telling them that. He's also showing them, listen, God has been calling Abraham, and he called Moses, and he called the people out of Egypt. But listen, so many of the children of Israel that you're looking to, and the fathers and all of these people, they didn't actually listen to him. And by the end, he really turns the tables on them, and he uses these things of showing how God has been calling, and God has been with them, and God has been delivering. But time and time and time again, the people turn their back on God and want to go back to serving the gods of Egypt or wanting to serve the gods of the Canaanites. And then he turns to the Sanhedrin Council, who understand they were the religious leaders and political leaders of the day, and he looks at them and he says, and you're just like them. You're just like them. And you killed the one that Moses had talked about. You murdered him. Now, of course, what Stephen, I'm sure, is hoping for and praying for is that they will see their guilt and that they will turn to the Lord for forgiveness. It is actually what happened on the day of Pentecost. Peter said a lot of the same things. And the people were convicted and they were repentant of what they had done. And they asked, what can we do? And the Lord saved a lot of people. Now, we know from our introduction to this that that's not what happened when Stephen preached to the Sanhedrin Council. Instead, they ended up murdering him by the end of the chapter, right? And to some degree, you might say, Stephen wasn't very successful, was he? Well, again, and I've said this a couple times, and I'll say it a few more, there was a guy at the stoning of Stephen named Saul, right? And he then went out and caused more persecution, but then the Lord got a hold of him and saved him, and he became the guy that was preaching a lot of the same stuff that Stephen was preaching. And years later, when Paul himself is basically on trial, he refers back to Stephen. He never forgot this moment here. So we can talk about whether Stephen was successful or not, but I will say the Lord used Stephen. The Lord used Stephen. And, we may not ever see the fruits of our labor in this life. We may not even know what downstream impacts it has. Keep on doing. Keep on serving. Keep on being faithful. Keep on preaching. Right? Now, that was kind of our introductory that we talked about here a while back. And what we've been doing since then is we've just been going through Stephen's message. And again, just to reiterate, Stephen was right. We're taking you back to the Old Testament places that Stephen referenced. And we're showing you where those passages were. And while we're there, we're taking a little bit of time and opportunity to remind you of those stories. Right? I often find, and I want to be careful because I don't want to spend so much time here in this passage that you forget the overarching reason why Stephen is doing what he's doing. And that's why I remind it every Sunday of what the theme is. But listen, I also find that when you go back and you study what he just gave a summary of, it makes his summary that much richer when you understand all of the things that he's talking about. So we've been down through the fact that God called Abraham, and then we saw that God had made a promise to Abraham and that through his seed what would come. We saw that they would be strangers in a land and they'd be there 400 years and then God would come and deliver them. We saw the idea of the covenant of circumcision that was given to Abraham. We saw how that they were delivered into Egypt and how that God blessed and how God provided through Joseph. We saw how that Joseph, even on his deathbed, knew God's promise was coming and said, "Take me out, take my bones out when you go." We saw how that another king arose that didn't know Joseph, and he dealt evil with the children of Israel. And we saw how Moses was raised up, right? Moses actually, I think, knew that he had a desire to see his people delivered, and he tried to do it his way, and it didn't pan out so well. And so he abandoned it, and he went and spent 40 years in the wilderness. And then in God's time, God called him. And God said, I'm going to send you back, and I'm going to deliver my people. Stephen takes the time to remind us, and I think this is an important parallel to Jesus Christ. Stephen took the time to say, hey, God used Moses, the one that our fathers rejected. Right? Remember what he's building up to. You got to keep in mind what he's building up to. He is building up to, just like our fathers mistreated the prophets, you mistreated the Messiah, and you're guilty. Interesting when you think about a guy being on trial, and yet by the end, he's going to accuse the judges. Right? You talk about boldness. What was it that they prayed for a few chapters ago? Lord, give us boldness. Well, Stephen had it. Now, that's kind of, when we went down here, we talked about Moses being in the wilderness 40 years, or in Midian 40 years, and the Lord coming to him in a flame of fire in a bush and telling him that he was going to go back. Telling them that he was the God of the fathers and how he would go and deliver the people. And then in verse 36, this is really where we ended. Verse 35, this Moses whom they refused, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. Moses was used of God to show amazing sights. Now, we call them amazing wonders and acts. They were plagues in Egypt, right? But listen, they showed the power of God. They showed that Moses was a messenger of God. And if you ever study those, we don't have time right now, but I will tell you that if you ever study in depth the plagues, you will start to see that each of those plagues was really attacking and undermining a different Egyptian god, a different Egyptian deity, or some thing they worshipped. Those plagues were very specific and very targeted. So God did all this, and then he parted the Red Sea. And listen, by the time the Israelites are following Moses, heading toward the Promised Land, they have seen some amazing things. Some things they could not explain. And they continued to see it with the manna and the water out of the rock and the quail and all of these things that they seen. And Jesus Christ, what did he do when he came to this earth? Man, he performed miracles and he had signs and wonders, and his teachings were one with authority, and people said, this guy's different. And what did they do to Jesus? Well, they rejected him. You know, if you remember the story of Moses taking them through the wilderness, you know what they did to Moses? Over and over and over, they rejected him. Now, in the end, their rejection was really not a rejection of Moses. Their rejection was of God. They were rejecting God, not Moses. And I think that's, again, a key part of this story. But where we're going to pick up is in verse 37. Stephen has spent a lot of time talking about Moses and how God called Moses and God used Moses and really laying out, right, the things that Moses had done. And remember, Stephen is on trial for saying, well, he claims that we should do away with the law and the traditions of Moses. Well, he just spent a lot of time talking about his knowledge of Moses. He understands the Sanhedrin Council and the Jewish people and how high of regard they hold Moses, right? Well, he's about to turn Moses' words against them. Because what he says is this: "This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me, him shall ye hear." He says, oh, that Moses we've been talking about, the guy that led the people out of Egypt and did all this amazing things. Listen, do you remember what he said? Well, he said that there's coming a day where God will send a prophet like me, and you will follow him. That is actually referring to Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18. I'm going to read, if you want to turn there, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and read this. Not the whole chapter, but I'm not going to just jump in and read the one verse that Stephen quoted, because I want you to understand a little bit about the context here. In verse 9, it says, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abomination of those nations. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearkened unto observers of times and unto diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee so to do." So he's telling them, you get into this land, you reject all that wicked idolatry and witchcraft and all those other things, and you be true to God. God will not suffer you to do what they did. And in verse 15 he says, "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken, according to all that thou desirest the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. And the Lord said unto me, They have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto them, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him." Listen, he is bringing them back to this passage and telling them, do you remember when Moses said that God is going to send a prophet, a different prophet? This is no regular prophet. This is a different kind of prophet. Listen, and this is going to be the one that is speaking the very words of God to you, and you will hearken to him. And if you do not hearken to him, I will require it of you. What is he about to say in a minute? He's about to say that you killed the one that God sent. I will require it of you. You are guilty. The rest of this passage goes on and talks about how to tell the difference in a false prophet versus a true prophet and some things along those lines. But listen, Stephen here is reminding them of the words of Moses. Moses was not the final guy that came, and Moses is the one that has revealed the Word of God to us, and that was the last revelation of the Word of God. Listen, there was going to be a prophet that would come and would fulfill the law. Jesus Christ spoke as one with authority. Do you know what that means? We went through that when we went through the book of Matthew. It meant that when Jesus taught as a first source authority on the Word of God. We're not talking about somebody who read it and say, well, I think it means this, and I think it means this, and my interpretation of that is this. No, Jesus spoke as one that had true authority. He's reminding them of that. He's also going to remind them of their rejection. It says in verse 38, "This is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel, which spake to him in Mount Sinai with all our fathers, who received the lively oracles to give unto us, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, and their hearts turned back again unto Egypt." Oh, wait. I just reminded them of the prophet that was going to come that Moses told about. And then I reminded them of what the fathers that they like to lift up and proclaim actually did to Moses. Wait, they rejected Moses. They rejected really the God that sent Moses. You say, well, no, the children of Israel, they followed God. Yeah. Brother Philip just recently went through what Stephen's about to talk about. Stephen's like, it wasn't even that long after God delivered them. It wasn't that long after they saw all these miracles. What did they do? Well, Moses went up into the temple to receive the oracles of God. And while he was up there receiving the oracles of God, they told Aaron, why don't you make us a God that we can serve? It says in verse 40, saying unto Aaron, make us gods to go before us. For as for this Moses which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we want not what is become of him. And they made a calf in those days and offered sacrifice unto the idol and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Now that shows the heart of the people right there. Now, Stephen here is actually quoting from Exodus chapter 32, verse 1. I'm going to back up a little bit from that, though, and we're going to turn, and again, you don't have to turn if you don't want to, I can read it, but Exodus chapter 24 is really where this story starts, and we're not going to read all the way to chapter 32, but I'll give you some summaries here. Exodus chapter 24. It says in verse 12, and the Lord said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone and a law and the commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matter to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. You understand that God calls Moses up into the mount. He leaves the people. He leaves instructions. He does some delegation. He kind of says who's in charge while he's gone. There's this great mist over the mountain, and they can't see it, and Moses disappears up into it. And it even says that the glory of God on the mountain was like a devouring fire. This is some scary stuff. And Moses just goes off into that. And it says that he's gone 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we can read that and we just bypass that, 40 days and 40 nights. But listen, what was it Philip said in Sunday school? When they come out of Egypt, there was at least 600,000 men, plus women and children. A lot of people. Their leader has just went off into this big, smoky, fiery mountain. And he's gone a day, and 2 days, and a week, and 2 weeks. You know, to sit at the base of a mountain in the wilderness for 40 days is a lot. We can read it quickly and think no big deal. They have literally followed Moses every step of the way out of the land of Egypt. And he's been gone for quite a while now. And as you look at this, what's happening in we're going to read this, but in chapter 25, the Lord tells Moses about the sanctuary and how we're going to contribute to the sanctuary. He talks about the Ark of the Covenant, the table of bread, the golden lampstand. In chapter 26, he gives them very specific instructions about the tabernacle. In chapter 27, he talks about the bronze altar. He talks about the cord of the tabernacle. He talks about oil for the lamps. I mean, he is giving him very detailed, specific instructions about all of these things. And we don't have time to get into it now, but many of those things have a very specific foreshadowing of the redemption story of Jesus Christ, okay? And that's part of why I think the Lord is so specific about how these things are to be laid out. But that's all what's been going on. In chapter 28, he talks about the priest's garments and how they're supposed to dress. He talks about in chapter 29 about the consecration of the priests, how they're to be set aside, how they're supposed to be consecrated for the service. In chapter 30, he's talking about the altar of incense. He talks about the census tax. He talks about the bronze basin. He talks about anointing oil. He talks about incense. I mean, he is just giving some very specific details. He even tells him in chapter 31, here's some people that I have called that are holy, and they have the talent to do these things that I've commanded you to do. The Lord has prepared people to go take care of these things. He even starts to describe to Moses about the Sabbath and how that's supposed to work. And all of that is going on the mount. And then we get to chapter 32, verse 1, which is what Stephen quotes. It says, "And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, get up, Aaron. Make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we want not what is become of him." Hey, we've been following this Moses guy and this pillar of fire and this cloud, but Moses is gone, and who are we supposed to follow now? Well, why don't you just make us a god, Aaron? Just whip one up for us. We need to serve something. We need to follow something. There's something that needs to go before us in the wilderness. Why don't you just make us something, Aaron? Because we don't know where this Moses guy went. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are the ears of your wives, in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in the ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Now you see the abomination that goes on here, right? Not only are they now saying we need a new God to follow, they are now going to credit this God with all of the deliverance they've seen up to this point. You see the complete wickedness of their heart and the rejection, really not just the rejection of Moses, but they are rejecting the God that Moses was declaring to them. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. By the way, that word Lord there, notice it's all capital. Aaron is still holding out this almost idea of, well, we're still worshiping Jehovah. We have just made an image that we're going to use to do it. And I'm not going to go into all that. Brother Philip did a really good job in Sunday school going through, and some of the classes going through all of that. But you see where the Lord said in verse 7, And the Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now he goes on, and God's going to destroy them, and Moses intercedes for them. Now, Brother Philip did a really good job of talking about that role that Moses had, and Aaron had even later, of interceding for the people. Understand, I believe that is part of part of when Moses says that the Lord told him he would send the people a prophet that was like unto him. Listen, Jesus Christ intercedes for us. He intercedes for us. That is one of the ways that he is most like Moses. Man, he stands in the presence of God and intercedes for you and me. But this is the story here that Stephen is referring to. And he reminds them of how the people quickly turned from God. They quickly left serving God and they turned to other things. But he's not done. Now we know that in this story in Exodus, Stephen is really giving some quick summary and snapshots of some things. Obviously, the Lord sends judgment. Moses intercedes. There's forgiveness. The people move on. They do okay for a little while. They fall away again. There's judgment. They turn back to God. It's just this reoccurring theme. But we also know that by the time they get into the land of the promised land and they've chased out the others and God has laid very clear instructions for them to not worship other gods, what happens? Well, Stephen actually tackles that too. He says in verse 42, "Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon." Listen, what started at the foot of Mount Sinai, while the very law and commandment was being given, just continued on through the course of their history. They served God in the wilderness for 40 years, but didn't get to go into the promised land because of all of their complaining and their rebellion and their rejection. All of which, while they were going through that time, were following the many things that God had told them to be doing, right? But what we find often is the mere acts of following the commands of God is actually not what God wants. Hey, you could have been a Jewish person that was fulfilling all of the sacrificial things and the purification things and doing all of those things, but in your heart be uncircumcised, and all of those things didn't mean anything. God would actually tell people that he would reject those things. Matter of fact, before we quote what Stephen is quoting, there is, let me see if I can find it here. Give me just a second. There's a place where this same phrase is used, the host of heaven, the worship of the host of heaven. I think it's in 2 Kings. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, listen to this. In 2 Kings chapter 17, this is talking about the fall of Israel and the exile. It says in verse 7, "For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel, and the king of Israel, which they had made. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God, and they built them high places in all their cities, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. And they set them up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burnt incense in the high places, as did the heathen, whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. For they served idols, whereof the Lord had said unto them, Ye shall not do this thing. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all the prophets and all the seers, saying, Turn ye from your evil ways, and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded you, your fathers, which I sent to you by my servants the prophets. Notwithstanding they would not hear, but hardened their necks, till the neck of their fathers that did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenants that he made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he testified against them. And they followed vanity, and became vain, and went after the heathen that were round about them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made them molten images, even 2 calves, and made a grove, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they caused their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire, and used divination and enchantments, and sold themselves to do the evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. They literally did every single thing God told them not to do. But I want you to notice that it started secretly. Up at the beginning, it talked about how that they did this secretly. Outwardly, they still worshiped the Lord, just like you saw what happened at the foot of Mount Sinai. Well, they tried to take that stuff and still give credit to Jehovah, but we're gonna worship him the way we want to worship him. We're going to make an image, and we're going to worship the image and lay that as the God that we serve. Well, listen, there's times here, and you see it in the nation of Israel often, where they would claim to be serving Jehovah, but in their heart, that's not what they were doing. And it really did come to the place, Stephen talked about it, right? But they really did start to worship the very hosts of heaven. But Stephen goes on here, and he quotes, he did say that they gave them to worship the host of heaven. You see that in 2 Kings, that same phraseology. But it says in the last half of verse 42, "As it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye had made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon." Now here he is actually quoting from the book of Amos, Amos chapter 5. And again, we could read just the verses that he's quoting, but I want you to understand the context of this whole chapter in Amos. Amos chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, "Hear ye this word which I take up against you, even a lamentation, O house of Israel. The virgin of Israel is fallen. She shall no more rise. She is forsaken upon her land, and there is none to raise her up. For thus saith the Lord God, the city that went out by 1,000 shall leave 100, and that which went forth by 100 shall leave 10 to the house of Israel. For thus saith the Lord unto the house of Israel, Seek ye me, and ye shall live." Even in the midst of this, he says, I told you, if you will just seek me, you'll live. "But seek not Bethel, nor enter into Gilgal, and pass not to Beersheba. For Gilgal shall surely go into captivity, and Bethel shall come to naught. Seek the Lord, and ye shall live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph, and devour it, and there be none to quench it in Bethel. Ye who turn judgment to wormwood, and leave off righteousness in the earth. Seek him that maketh the 7 stars in Orion, and turneth the shadow of death into the morning, and maketh the day dark with night, that calleth for the waters of the sea, and poureth them out upon the face of the earth. The Lord is his name." He says, man, you need to leave off all this other stuff, and you need to serve the God that is the creator of all things. Stop worshiping the stars of heaven. Worship the God that made the stars of heaven. Verse 9. That strengthen the spoiled against the strong, so that the spoiled shall come against the fortress. They hate him that rebuke in the gate, and they abhor him that speaketh uprightly. For as much therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink the wine of them. Listen. As the Lord starts to go through this, and he starts to talk about the idolatry and stuff, he actually also starts to get into some other things. He starts to talk about how that they have perverted judgment. and that they, instead of taking care of the poor, they abuse the poor. And they're doing all of these things. They've lost righteousness. They've lost uprightness. They've lost judgment. Now that sounds very familiar. Stephen, by the way, when he quotes Amos chapter 5, he may be talking to the Sanhedrin Council, the Jewish religious leaders of the day, mostly Sadducees with a few Pharisees scattered in there. And you might say, well, they weren't off worshiping golden calves. No, but as you study them, you learn that they had, especially the Sadducees, has really embedded themselves in with the Romans. Like they liked what the Romans brought. But they also had perverted judgment and justice. And you find that they were not being what they should be. Listen, they might do the sacrifices and they might tithe, but God said that the Pharisees even had tithed of the smallest thing that they had, and yet they had left off justice and judgment and love. Right? Some of those things that are in the heart that may not be reflected yet outwardly, you see that in the people that were eventually worshiping idols. You see that inside they had left off justice and judgment and uprightness. I don't know, but if you had a guilty conscience and you were sitting on the council and he quoted Amos chapter 5, you could either sit there and start talking about, well, I didn't worship the host of heaven. Of course, I defrauded that widow last week. Right? I mean, that's some of the things that we saw about some of these very rulers, the Bible tells us. But anyways, I'm digressing there a little bit. He continues to go here in Amos, verse 12, For I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. They afflict the just, they take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right. For the prudent shall keep silence in that time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that ye may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, shall be with you as ye have spoken. Hate the evil and love the good, and establish judgment in the gate. It may be that the Lord God of hosts will be gracious unto the remnant of Joseph. Therefore the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord saith thus, Wailing shall be in the streets, and they shall say in all the highways, Alas, alas, and they shall call the husbandmen to mourning, and such as are skillful lamentation to wailing. And in all the vineyards shall be wailing, for I will pass through thee, saith the Lord. Man, what a picture of judgment that's coming. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. Listen, and listen close. And this needs to be a warning to those that put on a cloak of righteousness that are not. There are many people, even in this country today, that put on a cloak of religion and maybe even call for, look, the Lord is coming back. The day of the Lord is coming. You know what he says? He said here, Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? For the day of the Lord is darkness and not light. As if a man did flee from a lion and a bear met him, or went into a house and leaned his hand on the wall and a serpent bit him. You see here this idea of men that are fleeing from danger to get to that thing that they were waiting for, the safety of their home, so to speak, and to lean against the wall in final safety, only to be bitten by a serpent. He says, you be careful calling for the day of the Lord to come, because it's not going to bring you what you think it's going to bring you. Shall not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light, and even every dark and not brightness in it? I despise your feast days. I will not smell your solemn assemblies. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy song, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as water, and righteousness as a mighty stream. And this is where Stephen quotes, Have ye offered unto me sacrifices and offerings, O house of Israel? But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and shrine, your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. Therefore will I cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, saith the Lord, whose name is the God of hosts. Stephen here refers them back to a chapter that talks about everything from idolatry to the abandonment of righteous judgment. And he even tells them, look, those of you that are looking forward to the coming day of the Lord, you better rethink it, because with where you're at right now, the coming day of the Lord is not going to be what you think it is. And he says, and I think this is what he's reminding them of, listen, you can worship and sacrifice to God for 40 years. But in the end, God knows your heart. God knows where you're going. God knows what you're going to do. And God knows that eventually you are going to follow those vain things. Man, he's covered a lot of ground with them. I know he just gave a summary, and we're then going in and taking and showing the context of the things that Stephen was doing. And I don't want you to lose sight of the overall message that Stephen had, but I also want you to understand that every one of these places that he quotes goes even deeper than what Stephen had time to go into. You are talking to a group of people that are very familiar with these passages. He would not have just quoted Amos chapter 5 and they would have only thought about that one verse. Listen, their mind would have been drawn back to all of those things that were going on before the Lord led them into captivity. Or maybe I should say sent them into captivity. Stephen is building up to, listen, God has been with us and called us and given us His commands. But throughout all of our history, our hearts are weak and have not truly accepted Him. Even oftentimes when it may have had an outward appearance of accepting Him, we weren't. And I use that we as a general sense. Obviously there were people that did. But listen, he is building up to this idea of God is not just over here in this temple. You can go to that temple every day and you can put on the outward appearance of serving God. But when God sent His Son, you rejected Him and you shed innocent blood. And you can go sacrifice in that temple all day long. God is not going to hear you. You need to recognize your guilt and turn to Him. What was it that Amos, the very chapter that Stephen had quoted, multiple times said, seek God and live. Turn from your wickedness and live. Man, he has given them a chapter, interestingly enough, right before telling them they're guilty. He has given them a passage, a chapter that would remind them that yes, God's judgment is coming. But in that very passage, in that very section where he's talking about God's judgment is coming, is a very passage that reminds them of God's mercy and grace when you will turn from your wickedness to Him. Now we're going to close there, and when we come back, we'll pick up some of these passages about the tabernacle and the temple, and then we'll get into what I've been saying over and over again about how he turns the tables and says, I'm not just talking about your fathers anymore, I'm talking about you. Right? All right, we're going to go ahead and end there. We are thankful that you guys are patient with me as we try to work through this chapter. And hopefully it's an encouragement and a blessing to you. But we'll go ahead and have Brother Philip come and lead us